So Grant, do you want to?
Sure. Okay, what's the name? Do you remember the name for that guy who reads the Bible? Everyone else is silent.
What's the name?
Which guy who reads the Bible?
In
Like
the monastic
monasteries.
communities, the one who does the
I'm sorry?
readings. In monastic communities, the guy who does the readings.
I imagine he's slightly elevated.
Yeah.
Okay. So I take my title for this presentation from the very final words of Sextus Empiricus's Outlines of Skepticism, which are, a weaker argument is sufficient for them to achieve their purpose. And I'll that comes up this very last section of the Outlines of Skepticism. The previous paragraph 279 of Book 3, ends like this. We here bring to an end the third book in the entire treatise of the Outlines of Skepticism. Except then it says, we add this coda to the very end, and you get this final chapter. And the final chapter brings up this thing I had a question about pretty much the entire time I was taking this Ancient Skepticism course with Alan Code, and partly motivated by juxtaposing the skeptics to the Peripatetics or to other, sorts of ancient philosophers that came before the Pyrrhonians in particular. The chapter is entitled, Why Do Skeptics Sometimes Deliberately Propound Arguments of Feeble Plausibility? And so I was always wondering, what are the regulations and constraints that a skeptic might have with respect to creating equipollence, which is setting equal arguments against one another. If you believe P, you produce an equally strong argument that not P. If you do this, it results in equipollence. According to the Pyrrhonians, the upshot of equipollence can be epoche, a suspension of all sorts of belief, and then necessarily from epoche, but unintentionally, comes ataraxia, the freedom from disturbance. And ataraxia, it seems, is something a lot of dogmatic philosophers and inquirers in general were after to begin with. What they really wanted was an explanation. They were disturbed in some way, and that's why they seek philosophy. You might think otherwise. You might, for instance, remember Aristotle believes philosophy begins in thauma, and so it seems like the picture of the motivation or the primordial urge to philosophize for Pyrrho is slightly more pessimistic. It's more the diatima thing, that human beings have some innate lack, and so therefore we're driven to philosophize. We have disturbance, and so we're going after ataraxia or something like that. So what are the constraints? What on the one level, what sorts of arguments is a skeptic allowed to use to make someone who believes P consider an argument that they take to be equally strong that not P? If they're dealing with a philosophical novice, can they use kinds of sophistry and fallacious arguments? It seems like the concluding words and the title of the concluding chapter suggest that they can. But you might ask further questions. If we were able to create a pharmaceutical drug, some kind of pharmacon that was able to induce ataraxia directly, is there any reason that we're committed to using arguments to induce epoche if you could get to epoche other ways? So constraints on kind of intellectual honesty, rationality is one question, and then questions more generally about method. Do we need to stick within equipollence? Is that necessary? Is some kind of argument required or something like that? But frequently throughout this paper, introducing disturbance as the primordial motivation for all philosophy and for skepticism by Sextus's Lights. There's already something kind of therapeutic or medical about what the practice is doing, that we're in some kind of troubled state and it's trying to relieve us of our trouble. It seems like you'll give arguments towards particular people or particular beliefs, so it seems like skeptic arguments oftentimes won't be generalizable. They'll be aimed at particular beliefs of particular people. And Sextus's name is Sextus Empiricus. Empirical medicine was really important and that sort of thing. So to kind of motivate my philosophical framework, which is a skeptic philosopher kind of acting in the place of a doctor. He's the active one. You might think of just Aristotle's concept of doers and patients, or actors and patients, or something like that, where I'm going to be treating the skeptic philosopher kind of in the role of the doctor, and the one who has the belief, I'm going to externalize that into another kind of person who's a patient, And right now I'm going to start reading a paper which tries to explain why it might be appropriate to use this medical context to think about skeptic philosophy. And so I'm particularly going to bring this up with respect to Sextus's intervention on the debate between dogmatic medicine, empiric medicine, and Methodist or methodic medicine, which is a running concern. I think Emily maybe brought it up in passing yesterday or something in Outlines of Skepticism. Okay, so empiric medicine is a school of medical practice which developed in the 3rd century BCE and defined itself in opposition to practitioners of medicine who held that correct treatment of patients at least some of the time requires a grasp of hidden underlying causes of health and disease of the kind that can only be attained by reason. Oh, so by the way, for this first section on the medical stuff, I'll be quoting largely from an article James Allen wrote on medicine and history in the Cambridge Companion to Skepticism. Allen Code, for his course on skepticism, just used the Cambridge Companion to Skepticism as kind of a textbook. And so this is kind of the definitive treatment of the interrelation between skepticism and medicine in that companion. So I'm kind of using it as my guideline for this background. Okay. So empiric doctors grouped their rival schools of medicine which shared this etiological feature under the label rationalists. So rationalists are the ones that are looking for hidden underlying causes that can only be attained by reason. So I said dogmatists before, I'll say rationalists for the hidden causes kind of doctor, and initially their dialectical kind of rival was the empirics. And empirics, it seems like, can take different sorts. They're defining themselves as any sort of medicine that doesn't look for these underlying causes in a rational way. So maybe you could look for them in an irrational way and count as empiric, but maybe not, because the underlying causes are. Okay, later, an alternative to empiric medicine developed, another kind of rival school developed against the empirics called methodic medicine. Whereas empiric doctors practice medicine by attending to observation and memory alone, methodic doctors operated according to knowledge of apparent generalities, which diseases somehow manifest. Both empiric and methodic medicine accepted commemorative signs of concurrent events which are not disputed in everyday life, and further, both empiric and methodic doctors define their practice in opposition to rational explanations of hidden causes. So they have a common enemy, and they're both using something like commemorative signs, though they seem to understand and explain what commemorative sign is in a kind of disputed way. However, methodic and empiric doctors differ in the way they conceptualize appearances and phenomena. According to methodic doctors, some appearances could be indicative signs, which connect an appearance with its non-evident nature or constitution. So methodics took these indicative signs between an appearance and something not evident as a possibility, and therefore the disagreement between the methodics and the empirics pivoted for the most part on their practitioners' doxastic attitudes and epistemological theories, that is, about the sorts of causes underlying appearances and what we were able to know about them. Skepticism, which began as a view developed in Plato's Academy and over time evolved into different programs centered in new locations, became associated with those schools of medicine, namely the primarily the empiric, but also the methodic ones that appeared, which opposed the rationalists. Galen, for instance, writes that empiric medicine is the medical branch of the skeptic way of life. So Galen then has a genus, which is the skeptic way of life. You can do skeptic philosophy, or you can do skeptic medicine. And when you do skeptic medicine, you just call it empiric medicine, empiricism. Indeed, by the 3rd century, one of the foremost skeptic philosophers, Sextus Empiricus, received his name from his profession. He was a doctor. He was trained in the empiric school of medicine, as were at least some of his students. Indeed, ancient catalogs of Pyrrhonist skeptic philosophers show a significant portion were also empiric doctors. While Sextus's writing on empirical medicine has been lost, in his Outlines of Skepticism, Sextus actually gives philosophical reasons why his own Pyrrhonian skepticism better accommodates the underpinnings of methodic medicine rather than empiric medicine. So he was trained as an empiric, many of his students were trained as an empiric, his name is Empiricus, but nonetheless in Outlines of Skepticism he's endorsing the methodic view. And so kind of contra Galen, according to Sextus, the kind of medical branch, or at least the approved way of doing medicine for the skeptic way of life, is the methodic way. Crucially, Sextus draws an epistemological distinction between the methodics and the empirics. Empirics maintain that phenomena definitively cannot yield hidden causes through rational explanation, so therefore they're kind of like the old academy, the earliest version of skepticism, in that they dogmatically hold appearances cannot yield any kind of underlying hidden cause. But on the other hand, methodic doctors maintain that such a connection is possible. but to suspend judgment about whether the connection in fact obtains or not. So it might be, it might not be. We suspend judgment about whether in fact there are underlying causes. So that's really the epistemological distinction. You might wonder, are there any practical differences by observing practice alone? Could you tell a difference between these sorts of doctors? It seems like by and large they were training each other, and former practitioners in one school would leave to the next. So it seems like by and large their practical methods would have been the same. That's mostly speculative. Maybe other people have done more research into the practical differences between the two schools. And so next I will show that Sextus's commitment to using epoche pushes him to endorse methodic medicine and their suspension of judgment about whether phenomena include hidden causes. So I've kind of situated skepticism within this medical context a little bit, and now I'll go more into this epoche, which underlies the kind of methodic approach to a phenomena as opposed to the kind of empiric approach to that.
We have one question through.
Yes, I'm welcome.
So in James's article or elsewhere, do you know if Sextus ever articulates when and why the shift happens from him doing empiric medicine to Methodist medicine?
It doesn't seem like he ever had an ideological shift. There's no record that Sextus once thought that the standards and canons of empiric epistemology were rational. It seems like it was just in a community with empiric doctors. Maybe I'm not licensed to make all these sorts of conclusions and suspend judgment about these matters. But it seems like it's apparent. Yeah, actually you can accept appearances maybe. He trained by empirics, but it seems like he was kind of consistently against it. But then you might ask, when the split happened, that was centuries before that methodic split off of the empirics. And so the kind of conceptual distinction was out there in the world from the time of his infancy or something like that, but maybe he just grew up in a context with empirics, and then once he kind of developed that into a mature thinker, he sided with the methodic epistemology. That's kind of the way I understand it. So skepticism doesn't come, the word skepsis, which is inquiry, doesn't come up very much before the 2nd century AD or something like that. So it's one of the very kind of latest conceptual additions to the, I don't know what you want to say, theoretical vocabulary of the skeptics or something like that. So we say skepticism, but really it means this kind of, people traced intellectual genealogies. That was a big part. So if you trace yourself back to people like Archelaus and Nicodemus and that sort of thing, you're a skeptic. Also, broadly being pessimistic epistemologically is probably part of it. So Sextus's conception of skeptic philosophy is, he says, an ability, it's a dunamis, is what skepticism is, to oppose arguments with a twofold result, oppose them kind of equally, that's that equipollence. The twofold result is first the suspension of judgment, which I mentioned, epoche, and then it's unintended but not accidental psychological feeling of peace, ataraxia, that follows on it. So as far as I can tell, the first kind of theorist or thinker associated with the concept of ataraxia is in fact Pyrrho of Elis, and so Sextus's emphasis on ataraxia kind of traces back to Pyrrho in a fairly robust way in that sense. He used it as a technical term for freedoms of disturbance that his own philosophy offered. He also mentioned prognosune or something like that as a kind of almost synonym, it seemed like. But Pyrrho believed that nature itself, he had an actual belief about what nature was. He believed it was undifferentiated, unmeasurable, and unjudgeable. And so that's what's repeated in these doxa of Pyrrho, because for the most part he was just scared or his friends were helping him cross the street and he's bumping into walls and stuff like that. So it seems like the one thing we can really get out of him is that he was undifferentiated, unmeasurable, and unjudgeable was his belief in nature, and thus that consequently led him to suspend all his judgments about, apparent reality, the sensible world, and that sort of thing. Yeah.
Does Sextus give us that model of Pyrrho? Because it's really interesting that we're moving from belief that's devoutly held to equipollence to...
So I'll talk about Sextus's history of philosophy. It's severely lacking. He doesn't give us that about Pyrrho. This is from David Sedley, who cites these doxographers with this view. And so Sedley wants to say the ataraxia part is kind of a fair characterization of Pyrrhonian skepticism, because there is this kind of global suspension of belief, except Pyrrho did have one belief that that kind of motivates all the epoche. which is this kind of Parmenidean maybe picture. I feel like this is pretty attractive if you take Parmenides seriously, that the practical upshot is this kind of Pyrrho of Elis type suspension where you bump into walls and all that kind of stuff. I think it's quite actionable.
This thing about bumping into walls and stuff,
Yeah.
this is probably propaganda, right?
Well, Alan Code thinks that Pyrrho of Elis was autistic. And so all these kind of crazy behaviors which are reported about him aren't like philosophically robust or something like that. They really come out of this mental illness or something like that. And so we're in a medical context here, so it's actually quite relevant whether Pyrrho was like medically ill or something, and therefore he had, and I'm about to get to this, a very different telos for philosophy, rather than the mentally healthy person who pursues philosophy for its fineness or something like that. Imagine someone who's just, suffering because of their cognitive state. They might go to philosophy for ataraxia rather than the kalon or episteme or
Yeah, I
something
just
like that.
imagine such a person.
Like extraordinary tolerance of physical pain, right? But like, there's another testimony about him that like someone was like fixing his broken arm and he was just like talking away while it was happening. Like,
I don't remember that one. That's a good
I
one.
remember Alan mentioning that
Okay.
in connection with his remarks about Pyrrho on the spectrum.
And so Nussbaum has done a lot of work on Epicureanism, and I'll be citing her book, Therapies of Desire, frequently throughout this talk. And so she has a chapter on how Epicurus reoriented ancient philosophy around mental health, crucially around this notion of ataraxia. And so that happened centuries and centuries before Sextus and Pyrrhonian skepticism in like the 3rd century AD or something like that. And so Pyrrho is maybe this like antecedent for this kind of sea change we get with Epicurus, where the discipline of philosophy moves away from at least all its practitioners aiming at knowledge, virtue, fine, that sort of thing, and towards ataraxia and mental health. Okay. Whereas other dominant schools of ancient philosophy aimed at excellence, arte, or happiness, eudaimonia, Epicurus' and subsequently Sextus' goal is distinctly psychological. I write, Alan Code has marveled at what sorts of political disgraces the Greek world must have suffered in Hellenism to change the outward outlook of its brightest lights from such a lofty aspiration to such a pessimistic one. If Sextus could have prescribed a pharmacon for ataraxia, like we can produce today, would he have still employed investigation or used chemical epoche as a tool? Do we need to treat the happy dogmatist preventively is another question. If the dogmatist philosopher takes him or herself by their own lights to be happy, is the skeptic doctor nonetheless, going to try to apply this kind of, it's like taking out their molars or something like that, preventatively try to induce epoche or not. So yeah, these are some of these guiding practitioner type questions I just brought up there. So, now going back to Sextus. Sextus innovates on Epicurean philosophy by pioneering a new route to ataraxia, epoche. Sextus defines epoche as a standstill of the intellect, owing to which we neither reject nor posit anything. Crucially, to maintain epoche, one can say what is apparent to themselves and report their own feelings without holding opinions, affirming nothing about these external objects. So Sextus uses that to diffuse a lot of apraxia charges, that you can't act, you can't live your skepticism, because for Sextus you can go by what is apparent so long as you do so without holding opinions or something like that. Though you might push back and object, maybe there is something very incoherent about human psychology that you can't kind of live without beliefs or something. That's still an open rejection. Sextus introduces, epoche from a distinctly psychological perspective. So he says the skeptical persuasion then is also called suspensive. It's like instead of the skeptics, we could go around saying the suspenders, from the feeling that comes about in the inquirer after the investigation. According to Sextus, psychological disturbances generate our incipient motivation to pursue philosophy in the first place. However, philosophy fails to yield definitive answers to pacify those disturbances. Thus, instead of seeking to generate definitive answers, the Pyrrhonian skeptic aims to set arguments up against each other in her mind in order to yield suspension of judgment epoche about whether a particular proposition at the root of one's disturbance is true or false. And given that faced with equipollence, Aristotle urges us to... returning to the Aristotle and some of this code stuff. And given that faced with equipollence, Aristotle urges us to draw further distinctions to resolve our aporiae. So you can go from the peripatetic perspective, and sure, we encounter aporiae all the time. We have equipollent situations, but what we have to do is do philosophy. We should draw further distinctions and keep thinking about it. We don't just pacify our intellects and try to slow it to a stop. You keep, pushing for the lucis and try to untie the knot or something like that. So why should we accept sexist urging to give up when the going gets tough? Because we get what we want. Yeah. One reason is because we can get what we want anyway. If the goal of philosophy is ataraxia and giving up gets us right to ataraxia, maybe then there's nothing putting pressure on us to kind of be these virtuous inquirers or something like that, since we got the upshot of what the original motivation was. Can sexists draw a philosophical novice to merely apparent aporia? So something that's not really an aporia, can he kind of present fallacious arguments to build an aporia, and then knowing that there's a lusus to this apparent aporia, not provide that lusus to the novice, and so they'll lead them into a false equivalence, knowing they could get out of it, but if it, leads to epoche and anorexia in the patient, is that sufficient for him? In this final chapter, this idea that you can put forward arguments of feeble plausibility, and that it's sufficient for them to achieve their purpose. It definitely seems like you can. Okay.
I have a really ignorant question. So, so one thing you said, and yeah, one thing that seems to be suggested by some of the things that he says that I have read, is that, anorexia can't be, aimed at directly. It's got to emerge sort of, per accident. Can epoche be aimed at directly?
So epoche is... It seems like an intentional act where the agent is frustrated and gives up or something like that.
Right.
So I think you can.
You're aiming at giving up.
Yes. Yeah. You've given up your aim, but you do so intentionally. It seems like.
There's something.
Yeah. So Aptos grows frustrated and he throws his paintbrush against the painting.
But
I
he's
think
not
he throws
aiming
his
at the
paintbrush.
frustration. He's aiming at the painting.
He's as I see, given up the practice of painting. He's no longer trying to paint as he throws the brush.
But when he gets frustrated and gives up, he's not aiming at giving up. He's
That's a question.
At
What the new aim is, I think the view is aims might be part of what cause our disturbance, and somehow once beliefs too are a big part of it, but beliefs and aims are maybe connected. Once we get rid of the aim, it has this effect that sexist doesn't even try to give a systematic account for it. It's kind of not the job he takes himself as doing. He just reports phenomena as if it was history, just these events. And just it happened to some guy that he gave up on an end, and suddenly he felt really good. And so we keep going after this and doing it, and it just, tends to work.
I guess what seems odd to me about that picture is, if you think that part of the reason why we're disturbed is because we have aims, I don't know. It seems to me like the kind of person who's already aiming at, giving up is already somebody who's kind of given up on aims.
Yes, so I think...
So I'm trying to figure out, where...
Great, so I think it's you're aiming at truth, or you're aiming at philosophical knowledge, or something like that. So you give up your aim of philosophical knowledge, not your aim of ataraxia, I think. If you're you're still feeling disturbed, you go to philosophy to relieve that disturbance, you keep trying, you say, there's good arguments on both sides of this philosophy, I'll never get philosophical knowledge. It's just impossible to solve. And then I guess there's a question about how intentionally you can be about giving up aims or something, but you at least do give up the aim, and then following quickly from that comes this kind of feeling of
but on the way you are sort of striving in good faith for some kind of truth.
Yes, especially initially. The thing is, as Sextus describes it, these beliefs can kind of be recurrent and keep popping up, and so there's this weird self-practice where you might need your patient to come in for checkups every few months and say, have any new beliefs popped up? Okay, what kind of fallacies can I apply to those today? And send you back out the door.
But
and then it might become more disingenuous, and in what sense are you really, truth-oriented? And this I'll come back to. Because skepticism is called skepticism, it has inquiry. Inquiry seems truth-oriented, so maybe a constraint on skeptic practice is the truth orientation of the practices or something like that, which would speak against the pill types, or at least the fallacious type stuff.
At least practice, if not the agent. Okay, no, but that's very helpful. So the thought is you do have to start out doing it in good faith, otherwise this is kind of incoherent.
Historically, it has started out in good faith. The sorts of bright lights that feel these disturbances, they're great and excellent men, but something's wrong, and this is what they did, and this is, this is what happened.
Okay, thanks. Sorry.
Yeah, did you have something to do?
Well, so it feels like if I'm if I'm coming in for my weekly booster shot of skepticism, the reason why I'm coming in, either it's going to be because you think there's this deep-seated psychological mechanism where I can't help but have arguments bubble up from the subconscious or something of the sort, which would be an odd position to hold maybe, or it seems you do have to hold on to a desire for truth in one form or another, and then just like resign yourself to not being able to get at that truth. But you still have the way I thought you were articulating it. It was that you like gave up the desire for truth itself.
So I don't have a considered opinion about this. I'll get to theorists who discuss it more explicitly.
Cool.
You might wonder whether the latent desire for truth, unsatisfied, whether it's compatible with anorexia. And it might be.
Right. Yeah. So
Maybe
I
there's
think
these
about that's kind of, I mean, not even latent. So I've always just wanted to read the skeptics as thinking like, no, you keep going about like looking for truth, coming up with an argument. But the dunamis you've developed is whenever you come up with an argument that makes you like come to believe that P, you have immediately the capacity, by way of all of the argumentative modes that Sextus gives you, of like coming up with an equally strong argument for not P.
So
that means that the desire for truth never disappears.
That's the Katya Vogt view, where she wants to be very kind of robust about inquiry. That these are really inquirers in a kind of epistemologically virtuous way or something. So we should take as a model their kind of attitude of continued inquiry. We should all not be settled into dogma and always be, inquiring more about these sorts of things. And so there's a question of how seriously you want to take inquiry. So now, to contrast to Katya, let's look at Martha Nussbaum, 1994, and how she describes Pyrrhonian skepticism as it would have been practiced by Sextus. She says a student occupies the role of a patient. So she has kind of this philosophical philosopher-teacher, student, and that's similar to the doctor-patient kind of relation for her. So a student occupies the role of a patient who, according to her, begins by describing to the teacher the dogmatic beliefs that they have failed to bring her comfort, revealing as many commitments as she cares about, and the degree of refinement and sophistication with which she grasps the arguments both for and against them. So first you come in for your diagnostic, we're trying to figure out what's wrong with you. The skeptic, philosopher needs the student or patient to reveal what her beliefs are that are not bringing her comfort. You might wonder whether she has sufficient introspection, but maybe just she could list all the beliefs and the skeptic could figure out which ones aren't bringing her comfort. Revealing how many commitments she has and what she cares about, and the degree of refinement and sophistication with which she grasps the arguments both for and against them. And so this one's crucial, and you might think that here at least is some constraint on the types of arguments the skeptic philosopher can give, at least those arguments that would be convincing to their patient, to the student, or something like that. And so skepticism dialectically frequently was aimed at Stoics. Most of the kind of main tenets of skepticism are really just responding to a certain sort of Stoicism. David Sedley's 1983 paper on this is really great on Arcesilaus, on how he was like this proto-Stoic right in Chrysippus' school, and he just like failed to get it, and so like out of anger he invented this skepticism or something like that. Like he went through this thing of trying and failing and all that kind of stuff.
Always great. Did philosophy have spite?
Yeah, exactly. So, but I guess from its historical beginning, history is very tied up with skepticism in a way it isn't for other sorts of philosophy. It's always been dialectical, so it takes the standards and canons of its opponent or its prospective students or something like that. So this kind of judging the refinement and sophistication, Alan Coe would talk about as the standards and canons of the opponent or the patient or something like that. You adopt those and then you try to show from that perspective there's all these equipollent arguments you can give to get them to suspend belief of all the dogma of whatever sort of philosophy that they have. So a Pyrrhonian skeptic occupies the role of a doctor who, once this diagnostic is done, will now proceed through her beliefs, bringing forward counter-arguments again and again through the entire range of her beliefs, and she will be led into suspension, into epoche. And Nussbaum emphasizes passages where Sextus underscores the practical aim of skeptic philosophy and likens the skeptic's philosophical practice to the medical doctor's. And notably, in Book 3 of Outlines of Skepticism, 280, so let's see where that is. Yeah, the very last passage here. Some of the content from it is that Sextus argues that a good doctor will not... Oh, no, this is according to Nussbaum, summing up this paragraph. In it, she says, Sextus argues that a good doctor will not give the patient an overdose, but will carefully calibrate the dose of medicine to the magnitude of the disease. So it's, looking to the patient for the criterion of the treatment. Even so, the skeptic will carefully gauge the degree to which the pupil has been infected by the disease of belief. So she's highly kind of medicalizing what the skeptic is doing, what the Pyrrhonian skeptic is doing.
Does this poem give any reason for why you wouldn't want to overdose? Feels like giving a second, like an extra immunization shot isn't going to be harmful.
Yeah, so let's just read the passage. It's very short, so we'll see how fair her characterization is. Skeptics are philanthropic and wish to cure by argument. That's pretty explicit. Against the pill. As far as they can, the conceit and rashness of the dogmatists. Just as doctors for bodily afflictions have remedies which differ in potency and apply severe remedies to patients who are severely afflicted and milder remedies to those who are mildly afflicted, so skeptics propound arguments which differ in strength. They employ weighty arguments capable of vigorously rebutting the dogmatic affliction of conceit against those who are distressed by severe rashness, and they employ milder arguments against those who are afflicted by a conceit which is superficial and easily cured and which can be rebutted by a milder degree of plausibility. It's interesting, Sextus is phrasing it in terms of plausibility, but the way I think about it is usually in terms of fine-grainedness and philosophical sophistication or something, and those might be the same, and we should look at the Greek on plausibility. This is why those with a skeptical impulse do not hesitate sometimes to propound arguments which are sometimes weighty in their plausibility and sometimes apparently rather weak. They do this deliberately, since often a weaker argument is sufficient. So this is just saying sufficient. So maybe it's saving effort on the part of the skeptic, but it doesn't seem like it takes much more effort to put forward more plausible arguments. Like easier to do less plausible arguments or something like that.
If it's stronger, then the person might just get convinced of the opposite.
Yeah. Oh, that's fantastic.
But
So then the problem doesn't.
I like that.
Yeah.
But a proper, like, a skeptic at the point of being a doctor who has, like, developed this dunamis sufficiently should be capable of providing equally strong arguments on both sides. So if I give you a super strong argument for not P, such that despite having come in with the thought that P, you end up believing the not P at the end of our discussion, I should be able, given that I'm, like, my ataraxia is stable, because my epoche is stable, I should be able to just like turn around and give you an equally strong argument for P.
Yeah, but then it'll never end.
Exactly. Yeah. So because all you care about is that you end up with equal degrees of conviction on both sides of the question, right? So it doesn't matter to you how many are. It doesn't matter to you like how many. But you usually give. But there's no reason to like spend all day running through all the arguments if you can just like give one argument and reach it. Okay.
So one of the thoughts might be then that like if I give you only the sort of booster that's only going to last for a couple of days until you run across an argument that's even marginally stronger, like if we've just reached that very low line level, like you gave me a very weak argument and I gave you a very weak argument to the contrary, then like that's when it seems like it should be undone very easily. Now if the goal is to develop a dunamis, then we're in different territory. But if the goal is just to have like equally strong arguments, and it feels like providing as strong arguments as possible on both sides, so long as they're equally strong arguments on both sides, then that should put you in a better position, not a worse position.
In a more stable.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I mean, it could also be there's some assumption in the background about like what kind of person is likely to be persuaded of something on the basis of really weak arguments. Probably somebody who's not very like philosophically sophisticated, and so giving them a super strong argument might actually just not have any kind of effect. So they might not really understand.
Right. Okay. So they just don't
It
get
might be
it.
better
might
to sort
be
of
more persuaded by
the
the 10
crappy,
modes
but
than
like
the 5 modes.
Right.
yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
And then something, that's helpful. It seems like effort, it ends up coming back to effort then, given the kind of counter-reasoning that you've provided, Thomas, against Soham's pretty helpful suggestion.
I really like Emily's suggestion, and Hughes, well, both of you, that it might also just be like as to the character of the person that's coming and their capacity for philosophical argumentation, which then like works well with your idea of sophistication, philosophical sophistication being the differentiating factor between the arguments, right? So a more philosophically sophisticated argument requires a more philosophically sophisticated audience.
Yeah, it's a place where the medical analogy isn't so close.
Right.
Yeah.
Because with the stronger drugs, the risk is that you'll harm the person rather than that it won't work if
Yeah.
the illness is mild. Yeah.
Even so, I mean, in medicine, there's still a notion of preventive medicine to kind of. So maybe the person has such a character that she's disposed to believe P-type, to have P-type beliefs, and the doctor just gives a stronger dose of not be arguments to just keep her from going back to be, because that the person is just disposed to like try her best to again try to believe P, but with a stronger argument for not P, she wouldn't be able to.
Yeah, no, that seems right. It seems like, it would depend on the case. I can imagine somebody who's just sort of like biased in favor of P.
Yeah.
In which case,
Yeah.
that's maybe somebody to whom you want to give a really strong like argument for not P.
Yeah.
But you can also imagine a patient who's just like generally really gullible and like really susceptible to being persuaded by any like fairly flashy argument, no matter what it's for. And that's maybe the kind of person to whom you want to give like the kind of fast and loose, but like possibly like externally.
So it seems like at this point you've set up the dialectic,
Yes.
so that there are two possibilities that seem to like greatly mirror contemporary debates in like consequentialism, for instance, right? So you have one option where you have this kind of like unrestricted teleologist, so like the act skeptic, you might think, to do anything and everything that's required in order to hit. Like
Maximize well-being.
Ataraxia. Well, you want to be careful about that. Whose well-being?
I just meant on the consequences.
I agree. So I mean, there are questions to work out. And then on the other side, you have like the Katia picture where it's like, oh no, it actually turns out these side constraints, like it's the examining that's valuable. And so a lot of these justifications are just sort of making the like straight teleological picture, like the act skeptical picture, more plausible. But I feel like the real question is whether, when push comes to shove, you're going to take the pill. And I wonder how you think you can get evidence for this sort of claim.
So,
or like on either side.
So part of it might be the motive is a big part, and what is the content of the desire? Is it just ataraxia? Is the desire to induce epoche, which leads to ataraxia? Is the desire to use equipollence to induce epoche to induce ataraxia? And then you might wonder, is it to, in an inquisitive way, in a truth-directed way, use equipollence? And so a lot of it comes down to debates in the secondary literature that I've looked at about trying to specify like the content or the underlying motivation of the skeptic, and a lot of titles have the skeptic's motivation in it or something like that in different sorts of views. So the inquiry is one constraint that I brought up, this kind of Katya vote possibility. I'm going to kind of canvas a few other possibilities. I already mentioned epoche and equipollence and stuff. So getting clear about exactly what the constraints are, because it doesn't seem it's kind of unlicensed teleology. Maybe the motivation is just ataraxia, but what the skeptic dunamis is refuting beliefs through argument. And you might wonder, someone with the motivation for ataraxia, to what extent will they use that dunamis if they have other dunamai at their disposal? If it's easier to use, like what if they have two dunamai? A, peripatetic philosophy, they could teach the person to be an Aristotelian, lucis, any aporia that comes along, but it's, a really expensive process, it takes 5 years, it takes a lot of effort, and, office hours and that sort of thing. Or you can just, every few weeks when your student thinks that something, is pretty plausible and they've started to believe it, you come in, you just, sophistically rip them apart.
But I feel like that doesn't really get at the question, which is like, what would it take to think that you have to be constrained through like truth-aiming inquiry or whatever, or like to have any motivation? Well, don't you have to have a view about what's valuable? And that's exactly the sort of thing they don't want to have.
So the thing about a view was valuable, this helps end my medical section, and it's this purgation metaphor that doesn't start with sexist, but sexist also uses. So it seems like skeptics frequently are arguing something in a positive light, and it's at least that ataraxia is valuable, and maybe that is, there's a connection between epoche and ataraxia or something like that. But
frequently a necessary connection?
Maybe a necessary, I want to say
at least
it secures it. Yeah.
Unless it's a necessary condition, you won't be able to secure the strong claim about side conditions.
That's true. You might be able to specify that it secures ataraxia and the skeptic doesn't have any other dunamai for doing so, let's say. So it might not be necessary, but it might just be the means of disposal that the skeptic has or something like that. But then I tried to come up with a situation which is not the only means of disposal. Right. But that's not the kind of entire project or something like that. And just to go back to purgation, so a purgative is something that you take and then its effect is to make you vomit it back up or something like that, but you don't just vomit up the thing that you took. It's whatever is causing your intestinal distress and your food poisoning or whatever. So the idea is that if you ever were to make these kind of value attachments to skepticism or something like that, again, the skeptic philosopher can just do the purgative and purge the skepticism one. So again, we want to be like the methodics and not the empirics. You can think of the two kinds of skepticism. There's academic skepticism, which dogmatically holds that belief is impossible or something like that. But Pyrrhonian skeptic is the different kind. You don't even hold that belief, where we suspend judgment about whether there are hidden causes of things and whether, in fact, you can. I'll end it there, but I think I'll move on to a lot of issues in this vicinity in the second half of the talk. So we're on page 5 of 14. Okay. I think with bibliography. Okay, so
14 pages since you got here?
No, so back in 2017 I wrote 5 pages when I took this course without code, and then I worked out the medical stuff a little bit later. So I haven't looked. Yeah, so I have all these articles with like all these underlined quotations, and so my method for this paper is picking back up these articles I already read and kind of highlighted for myself, and now kind of turning them into paper, just because I had other things I was working on in the meantime, so I didn't have time to finish this a few years ago. Okay. So now I'm turning to these constraints, kind of having set up and motivated this doctor-patient context. Having sketched the medical context and therapeutic psychological aim of Pyrrhonian philosophy, I can now conclude my discussion of how his commitment, conclude for the next 10 pages, my discussion of how his commitment to evidence pushes sexist away from empiric medicine. So early on in the outlines of skepticism, Sextus gives an extended description of how Pyrrhonian skeptics claim to live with respect to responding to phenomena even while suspending judgment. So I'm sorry, I go on and connect it back to the empiric methodic thing here, actually. I thought this was the end of the medical stuff. I can skip maybe these 2 pages about why he falls on the methodic side and actually move to the next section, like I was saying. What means can the skeptic avail herself of to treat her patient? Okay, so I'm moving on there. Okay. So Julia Annis explains features of Sextus's text on the basis of his motivational framework. She's not the only one. Sedley, Grigic, and others kind of right in this vein. And such that Sextus's motivations determine his skeptical strategy. There are at least 3 positions to take with respect to what motivates the skeptic according to Sextus Empiricus. So these are kind of the 3 main options. There might be distinctions within them that I'll look at throughout the paper. So the skeptic's motivation when confronted with a patient, let's say, or with respect to someone else, could be A, to turn his patient into a skeptic who will practice on other patients. So the job is like teaching and perpetuating the dunamis and kind of infusing it into others. B, inducing ataraxia in the patient and moderation in feelings in the patient by any means necessary. So this is the kind of unrestricted consequentialist S1. Or C, to induce ataraxia and moderation in feelings by some means and not by others. And by means, I mean both the method by which he accomplishes or she accomplishes their end and the standards by which he or she employs that method. So the kind of criteria and technique. One might, and so here I speculate on different sorts of means. One might give a patient a pill to induce ataraxia, epoche, or possibly even the cognitive effects of equipollence. You might be able to fire neurons to create beliefs against the beliefs that you have or something like that. But none of those involve argument, and so how much argument we want to specify is going to be important. Conceivably, a skeptic could employ other methods to inculcate ataraxia, or at least condition his patient to receive arguments that will inculcate it. So this is according to Nussbaum. Medical philosophy will often need to search for techniques that are more complicated and indirect, more psychologically engaging than those of conventional or dialectical argument. It must find ways to delve into the pupil's inner world using gripping examples, techniques of narrative, appeals to memory and imagination, in the service of bringing the pupil's whole life into the investigative process. And so these beliefs that you have might be, very deep and part of your identity, your life horizon, or something like that. And so Nussbaum thinks if skepticism is going to have this kind of medical drive, it would maybe succeed if it was less argumentative and availed itself of other sorts of rhetorical techniques. So I will try to answer the questions of how underhanded or unconventional or narrative a skeptic can be in a section of Outlines of Skepticism. I think that's 12 in section 12 in book 1, Sextus explicitly states the aim of the skeptical persuasion. And his formula for what the aim of the skeptical persuasion is: tranquility in matters of opinion and moderation in feelings forced upon us. And then at the end of that section, Sextus goes on to mention components that other skeptics have added to the aim of what the skeptic persuasion, what its goal is, or something like that, what Sextus calls the final object of desire. But he doesn't put these in his own final object of desire. And these are namely suspension of judgments and investigation, so epoche. So it seems like it's just the moderation of feelings and tranquility in matters of opinion. It's just ataraxia rather than ataraxia and epoche. That's the kind of ultimate motivation that Sextus wants to give. So there's this European theorist, Grgic, Grgic, and he's written some really interesting things on this topic, so I'll just say Grgic. Grgic highlights that Sextus might need to use a telos in an idiosyncratic way. So when he's talking about telos and the final object of desire, he might be talking about that, even though he never qualifies that, he's using it in a way different than dogmatic philosophers. So Grgic fixes what Sextus means by ataraxia, that is the final object, his motivation, from the perspective of one who, having been disturbed, the philosophical novice, having been disturbed, and not even having begun inquiry into the nature of things, and this is an extended quote from Grgic, could not have known how much inquiry would be needed, nor could they have supposed that any of the appearances are true and which are false of their own appearances. This is at the very beginning, where they have disturbance and they're going to philosophy. They don't know how much inquiry they're going to have to do. They don't know which appearances that they currently have are true or false. They could not have had a clear idea of whether life without disturbance should be accompanied by other states. That is to say, whether tranquility is only possible if accompanied by the absence of physical pains or the absence of passions or things like that. The novice, the just person at the very beginning of this process can't know that. They could have conceived of tranquility merely as a name for a highly indeterminate goal, the absence of disturbance. They could not have conceived of it as something that is by nature good, but only as something that, given the unbearable state that they have found themselves in, appears good. And he goes on to say that those have become Pyrrhonists, mature Pyrrhonists, have retained this original minimalistic conception of the goal. So it's their motivation, their kind of fundamental drive is ataraxia, but ataraxia in this very indeterminate way, just as the apparent value of the absence of disturbance. And any kind of content that the person at the beginning of their kind of inquiry would attribute for Grgic, you have to kind of remove from how you're specifying the end for Sextus. One thing I wanted to say is that a lot of what I'm saying about skepticism might have interesting consequences for philosophical protreptic. Both crucially involve this kind of novice figure who's just starting out in philosophy or something like that, and both involve trying to kind of cognitively address them on their own terms and by their own lights. And so something Chris frequently worries about protreptic is whether if you, like in the Euthydemus, let's say, use tendentious arguments to convince like a young man that the life of philosophy is most worth living, he might come to somehow be annoyed, or there might be some kind of downstream consequence when he comes to see that you use underhanded methods or something like that. So the same way that I'm kind of posing this project about the constraints and limitations and regulations for skepticism, you might ask a lot of these same questions about philosophical protreptic or something like that. Do you have a thought?
Well, I just have a sort of a question about
Sure.
the language that Sextus uses.
Sure.
So does he ever use the language of ought and ought not, or does he only use these kind of future tense expressions about what the skeptic will do?
I think he even makes meta-linguistic commentary that skeptics will frequently, let's see.
Oh yeah, they'll use
expressions, but it's always what is apparent. So we say then that the standard of skeptical persuasion is what is, let's see, I don't have the exact quote. Yeah, but the idea is that you might say things in the voice of a dogmatist or something like that, but what you always mean is that it's apparent that, or something like that.
Yeah.
I think that's...
Sorry, I just meant at an even cruder, just
Yeah.
like word search level. Like
Sure.
These people you're talking about use all this very normative language of
Yeah.
like constraints and what you kind of may do or may not do. Like, does Sextus ever talk that way?
I think when he talks about it, it's reflecting on that sort of language. When skeptics use this sort of language, he disclaims that, in fact, what we're really just saying is that it seems to us that. So that's when it seems like he rarely says that explicitly, but yeah, I'll take some questions. Okay. Okay, so I've done that Gridget quote. Okay.
Yeah, that'd be nice. Thank you.
So we've looked at Sextus's explicit statement of the motivation, which is ataraxia, and he says other skeptics put epoche in there, but I don't. But nonetheless, Julia Annis construes Sextus's motivation as broader than both the motivations listed at 125, which is like regulating the passions and somehow, and all the ataraxia stuff. And she attributes a motivation even broader than the drives of the other skeptics that Sextus mentions, who include epoche, unlike himself, and the motivation, the suspension of judgments and investigations as the final object of desire. Annis claims that Sextus includes equipollence in his ultimate desire, which he seemingly excludes from his aims in Book 1. So she says, Sextus's work is always driven by the desire to shape his material to the form most likely to produce the reaction which the skeptic aims at. So this is the reaction that she takes to be the motivation, reaching the position where arguments for and against pull with equal force, and one finds oneself suspending judgment on the subject. Sextus's strategies obviously derive from this drive. So she's saying that even equipollence you can kind of specify as part of the content for the overall motivation, which Sextus doesn't take himself to be doing. He says just ataraxia, let alone even epoche, let alone equipollence. Perhaps Annis is referring to equipollence as a lower order drive than the two ultimate or higher order drives that Sextus explicitly lists in 125, and it might be even determined by those higher order drives in some kind of way. We might think there's a necessary connection between the desire for ataraxia and the, epoche and equipollence in a kind of a lower order, maybe even necessary way. These lower order drives could be otherwise, but happen to remain stable throughout Sextus's work. However, she seems to consider suspending judgment to be part of Sextus's aim, despite his disavowal of that as his kind of primary goal. And in Book 1, again, Sextus distinguishes equipollence as what skeptics introduce an argument in order to do, as opposed to that for the sake of which the skeptic produced these equally opposed accounts. So Gridget, you use equipollence in order to do something else. It's not for the sake of which you're doing it. And Gridget observes that in Book 1, Sextus certainly does not want to say that the ability to oppose to every account an equal account is the intrinsic goal of the Pyrrhonist investigations, while tranquility is not. So Gridget says it's not just equipollence or something like that. That's pretty plausible. But there's a question again about how much content we want to put into the ultimate motivation. Further, Annis writes that Sextus's work is meant to turn us into skeptics. A weak reading of Annis's claim would read skeptics as those who have suspension of judgment in investigations, and thus just a reformulation of suspension of judgments in investigations. But a stronger reading of Annis's claim that a part of Sextus's motivation is to turn us into skeptics is that it would additionally require a skeptic to adopt a commitment to actively investigating or creating equipollence in addition to suspending judgment, probably with respect to other people, other patients, or something like that. That's the first option I gave when I gave the three possible options of what the constraints might be, what the goal might be. On this stronger reading, Annis will have added components of the skeptic's end, which Sextus does not explicitly commit to as the final end desire. Okay, so while Annis describes Sextus' motivations in terms of A, the skeptic producing more skeptics that act on other patients, or C, which is producing ataraxia through some constraint on the necessary means, I'm not sure that there's decisive evidence within the outlines of skepticism that requires Sextus to adopt an inherently inquisitive, let alone equipollent approach to producing epoche. It seems like it's his ability, but it doesn't seem like he's required to kind of adopt that means or technique. It is a significant issue whether epoche and active inquiry are parts of the skeptic's ultimate desire or not, because it will determine whether he has any single set of methodological, metaphilosophical, and inferential standards, or if those standards are completely determined by the particular features of the skeptic's patient. When the skeptic uses her capacity to investigate, she adopts both her patient's set of dogmas and the set of explicit and tacit methodological, metaphilosophical, justificatory, and inferential standards that her patient employs. So there's things that the patient might take explicitly to be her own beliefs, and things that the skeptic might be able to suss out as kind of underlying her inference patterns and all that kind of stuff. Annis's description of Sextus's skeptical attitude as the evaluative criterion for the features of his investigative practice lacks any particular set of investigative standards which the skeptic might always stick to, so long as his investigation is oriented towards his patient's ataraxia through providing arguments and, that produce equipollence. Thus, the skeptic's patient provides all the methodological, metaphilosophical, justificatory, and inferential standards that the skeptic uses on Annis's view, I claimed there. Whereas most dogmatic inquiries are guided by a single set of methodological, metaphilosophical, justificatory, and inferential standards, Sextus's skeptical strategy only stipulates a desired outcome, and thus can take whatever pattern is best suited for inculcating ataraxia in his patient. And then I have a long quote from Annis. She says, "Here it is salutary to recollect Sextus's skeptical perspective. The skeptic wants to free people of their dogmatic beliefs that they are unfortunate enough to suffer from. Where philosophical beliefs are concerned, it is likely that what is making most people suffer are beliefs formed in the context of the current philosophical debate. And this is what Sextus accordingly concentrates his attention on." So essentially, whatever the 3rd century standards and canons of inference and, philosophy, that's kind of, on her view, the authorial motivation that Sextus has as a skeptic, and that's like what's guiding the sorts of arguments that he provides. He is not obliged to hunt out exploded doctrines or to strive to recover outdated perspectives, that is to do kind of good history of philosophy. This would be a waste of time, since few or none are likely to be suffering from the effects or belief in them, and thus the skeptic has no motive to argue against them. Grigic offers some constraints on inquiry, which might be supplied from Sextus's understanding of ataraxia. So he says that Sextus explains how anomalies in the natural world cause disturbances, while he also claims that beliefs about what is good or bad by nature are responsible for those disturbances. So there's these beliefs about the natural world and appearances. The quote was, the sentence was, "Anomalies in the natural world provide disturbances," but it might not be anomalies alone. I think you need anomalies and beliefs to be disturbed. And so insofar as you want to inculcate ataraxia, you can do a conceptual analysis of disturbance and think what is necessary for being disturbed. You need to have at least appearances and you have to have at least beliefs. And so if beliefs are always or necessary for the causing of these disturbances, then at least it's going to have to be belief-oriented, your constraints on what you do with the patient will be directed at their beliefs. This might go back to what Nussbaum was saying about narratives and that sort of thing. Josh Landy has this view of what literature does, and it's not add beliefs, but kind of reorganize them or something like that. So that would de-emphasize the kind of literary approach or something like that, because it would just be belief-oriented or something like that. Rearranging beliefs wouldn't be sufficient, and some people take it that that's what narrative or literary rhetoric essentially does.
Sorry, is your view that the skeptic needs to do conceptual analysis?
No. So for us to read outlines of skepticism and figure out from this text what the constraints on the skeptic are,
okay.
One thing we might want to do is at least we have the motive. The motive at least includes ataraxia for patients.
Right.
And what can we get out of ataraxia? It's privative of disturbance, so at least what is disturbance? You need appearances that are anomalous in the natural world. That is, they don't go along with all your beliefs, or we could cash out anomaly in another way. And there's beliefs as well. And so that might help put some constraints on what they have to do. It has to be belief-oriented. And so there's lots of rhetorical effects that don't change your beliefs, but nonetheless move you or reorganize your beliefs or something like that. So that we can rule out at least as individually sufficient. You might be able to do it nonetheless for some reason. Maybe so that they don't come back later. You get them to remember it really well. Okay. So if beliefs are part of the cause of one's disturbance and removing them removes one's disturbance, then the skeptic has a strategy to induce ataraxia via equipollence because it worked for Apelles and for many others since. Perhaps Sextus thinks that equipollence is necessary for dispelling problematic beliefs, but we don't get that statement. We don't even get that it appears like that, but that could be the case. It just appears to Sextus that equipollence is the only way, and that's why. That actually would be pretty consistent. I like that.
Yeah.
Or perhaps Sextus was aware of no other strategies to remove problematic beliefs other than setting up equally strong arguments. But even if Sextus was aware of other routes to dispelling beliefs, which are the cause of disturbance, as this peripatetic way, let's say. And the route is the study of some correct dogmatic philosophy. Maybe he could satisfy by supplying his patients and students with only the technique outlined in Outlines of Skepticism. It would take a lot longer to write Aristotle's entire corpus. For Grigic, and to be fair, for Sextus, at the beginning of the Outlines of Skepticism, skepticism is an ability in virtue of which skeptics are able to eliminate those things by their nature that have determinate properties. I'm not sure I was doing with that quote. I was kind of writing this up till today. Okay. I have a little bit more to go. Let's see. So now we get more to these questions of intellectual virtue, and that's what really motivated me to begin with, because it doesn't seem like Sextus is operating with intellectual virtues, and learning skepticism from Alan Code, who, is thinking about Aristotle so much. You think about Sextus in relation to Aristotle, and he seems, like I'll go on to say, kind of, lazy. When the going gets tough, he seems just to let up. So that's what I'm going to address in this kind of final section. If Sextus aims only at producing a certain kind of mindset without any commitments to standards besides their practical efficacy, he may try in a number of practically effective ways that do not display intellectual virtues or are even intellectually vicious. Sextus, in fact, lacks the virtues of intellectual curiosity and thoroughness, according to Annis. Even if Sextus had the De Anima and Parva Naturalia handy on his shelves, he would have had little reason to peruse them. So he's kind of not interested in learning the deeper philosophical distinctions.
No reason to write a massive commentary on Aristotle, right?
Not for the skeptic, not for the Pyrrhonian skeptic, according to Annis, but I think that's merely contingent because historically it wasn't that live of an option philosophically in the 3rd century AD. I think that's why. But what did you mean by the commentary?
So what Sextus's corpus?
His Against the Mathematicians and Outlines of Skepticism, I think. And frequently things that are kind of vaguely Aristotelian, he'll kind of misstate frequently, so I think people better equipped to be Aristotle scholars than I am get frequently frustrated by the Aristotelian flavored arguments and the kind of objections he gives, the kind of equipolar arguments.
I wonder if he gets them wrong or if he's sort of quoting them from Peripatetics who are getting them wrong.
Yeah, according to Allen, it's these doxographies that started to circulate where they would take the views and not give any of the kind of reasoning behind it, and so anything that people in his region would have known would be from these doxographies. So that's
Sextus does get Chrysippus right. He is quoting from Chrysippus. Yes. He just doesn't have Aristotle.
So Stoicism was a lot more of a live option in the 3rd century, I think, and particularly for skeptics who kind of trace their genesis as being the dialectical opponents of Stoics. So it's always been, it seems like, important for skeptics to, because Stoicism comes with so much certainty in this kind of way to address the epistemological standards and canons of Stoicism, and that was going on through Cicero times for a century. So we're pretty close historically to the Stoicism skepticism.
Yeah, no, sorry, I totally thought that Sextus was recorded as writing commentaries, but he's not, so ignore that last outburst.
One intellectual vice that Annis observes in Sextus often, but which is compatible with his motives as a skeptic, is his intellectual laziness. For instance, Sextus is too lazy to carefully reconstruct historical arguments. Rather, he seems content to receive second-hand reports of dogmatic philosophy from popular doxographies, and nonetheless ineptly relays the views within them. According to Annis, he lacks interest to the point of being careless on an important point, in one instance. Further, he often considers cursory objections to dogmatic positions sufficient to producing epoche. According to Annis, he therefore just tries to counter each of the considerations he has mentioned, with often rather feeble arguments. The specific arguments against the peripatetic position are rather brief and feeble, just recycled generic skeptical strategies, something like that. So he's not kind of thinking through the particular positions as he goes through Outlines of Skepticism. Of course, this is all Annis's analysis of the text, so someone could read it and try to vindicate Sextus as a historian of philosophy. I tend to side with her, but that's a conceptual possibility that he is doing a good job. Finally, in addition to laziness, Annis also identifies the intellectual vice of dishonesty, or at least underhandedness. So Sextus seems to misconstrue the Aristotelian account. Her paper, by the way, is on Sextus and the Peripatetics, which I got because of kind of Alan's background and interests. Sextus seems to misconstrue the Aristotelian account. Sextus's construal might be quite deliberate, intended to facilitate criticism. And David Sedley points out that Sextus wasn't the first ancient skeptic with shoddy or outright wrong history of philosophy. He talks about Arcesilaus, and so Arcesilaus would mention his own progenitors, and he lists Socrates, Plato, Parmenides, and Heraclitus. So Sedley says, there's nothing haphazard about Arcesilaus' list of illustrious forerunners. Socrates, Plato, Parmenides, Heraclitus. It was, in all probability, Pyrrho's example that set him on his skeptical path, but the political considerations deterred him from exploiting its considerable propaganda value, or something like that. So Sedley thinks that for a skeptic, kind of whatever would be politically efficacious or something like that would guide, even their reports of history or something like that, which is one of the kind of primary modes of skeptic discourse or something, reporting history. You can even lie about that, it turns out, if it helps you politically. Yeah, did Apelles really throw his bread? Was the horse really good? Grigik maintains that skeptics persist in their inquiry. So now we're getting to the very last point about inquiry, and then I'll be done. So Grigik maintains that skeptics persist in their inquiry, and that mature skeptics have a goal, the discovery of truth, which they share with other philosophers. I'm not sure exactly how he's licensed to claim that. Katja Vogt has a similar view. She argues that the skeptic will always be employing investigation with her patient. If investigation must be truth-directed, then persuasion-directed inculcations of epoche do not count as skepticism. Just like you might think for contemplation, it has to be for its own sake or something like that. So if you're contemplating for another sake, it doesn't count as contemplation. In the same way, if you're investigating for some reason other than truth, it might not count as investigation. Few skeptics before Sextus had connected their own practice to inquiry. Sedley, 1983, clarifies the way in which Sextus meant inquiry. Sedley says by inquirer, Sextus, as it's normally understood by Sextus, is someone who sees at least an outside chance of finding the truth, yet a skeptic, although he or she might start out with this expectation, could hardly be recognized as a skeptic until he or she either abandoned it or at the very least had some hopes of doing so. The solution, I think, is to see the notion of open-mindedness as dominant in the word inquirer or something like that. So on Sedley's view, the truth-directedness of inquiry is not what's crucial for Sextus, rather it's this kind of open-mindedness. And in fact, according to Sedley, the skeptic should, in fact, be optimistic that there's just an outside chance of finding truth and kind of hopeful that they won't or something like that. Well, others interpret a coherent practice with habitual, and so then the kind of final view I'll put on the table is that of, I think, Harold Thorsrud, who says that it is not a foregone conclusion that one must hold beliefs, at least occurrent beliefs, to engage in coherent practices. And so you might be able to have a coherent practice of inquiry without holding any beliefs about how truth-directed it is or something like that. And so Thorsrud imagines the skeptic like a novice craftsman who may ingeniously imitate the master and even have a knack for making decisions well, but nonetheless does not know any of the causes and reasons that his master knows securely. So this apprentice, let's say, could copy the sorts of actions that the person who knows. In a similar way, the kind of inquiry that Thorsrud imagines that the skeptics do is kind of a mimicking one, where they don't take the kind of causes or reasons to be, they might not even know what they are, but they can kind of nonetheless engage in a coherent practice, which is akin to skepticism without the necessary truth orientation or something like that. Okay, so that's, I don't have a conclusion, that's kind of the paper, so yeah, final questions. We'll get to the symposium. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you, Brad. That was really cool. I had a couple of these both kind of fairly flat-footed thoughts. The first is that for this point about like would the skeptic use the ataraxia pill if it was available, there was that wonderful parallel passage in Epicurus. I forget, is it the Kyriadoxa or the Vatican sayings where he says that if the pleasures of wine if wine gave rise to the same pleasures as philosophy, then we'd advocate wine, not philosophy.
Right.
So that view was on the table, and Sextus never says anything like that. And I wonder if the reason is just this commitment to being, I just report the facts, and this is a counterfactual, and I'm not interested in that because like there is no ataraxia pill, and like trying to do these things through substances, trying to achieve tranquility through substances doesn't actually work, as it turns out. That's what you would have observed. The thing I was wondering, which is just kind of even more naive, is kind of when these people are worrying about like, oh, maybe he'll use like weak arguments. I mean, what are they thinking of that's like weaker than the ones that are already in Outlines of Skepticism? You know what I mean? Like you mentioned, like outright fallacious ones, like that would be something even worse. But like the stuff under the 10 modes, like the 5 modes are interesting. The stuff under 10 modes, like they're so bad.
So by
hundreds and hundreds of just incredibly unpersuasive things about like, well, you know, like a dog wouldn't see it that way. The Emperor Tiberius could see in the dark. You say the water is blue? Well, ice is black, and water is ice. You know what I mean? It's just like, it seems like it's right.
Yeah, there's just a distinction to be
about
made.
Kennedy Thomas.
There's the weakness of arguments that people like Annis are assessing within Sextus, and then Sextus himself refers to weak and feeble arguments. So are you wondering in the last paragraph, how could Sextus imagine anything is feebler than what we got in the preceding exposition?
Or just that, why should we doubt that he means what he says? Because he's given us a whole raft of feeble arguments.
I did start the paper with that title and that paragraph, so it does seem like some feeble. He doesn't. Intellectual virtue to the highest extent isn't necessary. It seems like you can satisfy. So we've talked about the reasons why, but then also reasons why you might as well give stronger arguments if you can just give the opposite argument. So it doesn't seem like he has really decided. He might as well be feeble, but there's not much reason he has to give these feeble arguments. Maybe we had a lot of considerations about that, but I think it is maybe helpful. I can take that usefully for my project, in which we can say, look at the sorts of arguments that Sextus gives. They're really bad, or something like that. And so you might wonder, did he intend for them to be bad or something? And so that might push you towards these intuitions about underhandedness and that sort of thing in the kind of authorial motivation. And I had a footnote about Annis is writing about the skeptic motivation frequently in terms of Sextus qua author and what he's doing in the text. So I had made this methodological footnote about, I'm talking about the skeptic that's described in the text. What's the motivation of, the sort of skeptic we get described? And I'm not really worried that Sextus is doing something underhanded. He might be. I'm just taking the project to be, can the sort of skeptic he describes be underhanded in these sort of ways? So that also moves
the is a somewhat different topic.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks.
Bunch of thoughts. That was really cool. By the way, and it's been a long time since I thought about skepticism. I forgot how passionately I like. This is one of the few places where I actually agree with Katya's position on something, so it's always really exciting to go back to it. So vis-a-vis Hugh's question, you might think that one of the reasons you get all these shitty arguments isn't because they're shitty simplicator, but because they're actually quite efficacious to certain people in certain situations, right? So like character-based arguments. So think of Pythagoras walking down the street, hearing the dog bark, and saying, I'm hearing my friend. Was it a dog that barked, or was it a horse, or...
Well, it wasn't a horse that barked.
Right. I forget which animal it was, but
which
like,
animal that noise?
But Pythagoras hears an animal that makes a noise and says he hears his friend talking to him or something of the sort, and then you could make a dog-based argument or something of the sort.
So I'm sorry, I didn't catch the philosophical shot of that.
Oh, the character-based, right? So like you have such a wide variety of arguments on the table that you can select the ones that are going to be most efficacious given the particularities of the person you're talking to, right?
Yeah.
And so they may seem like shitty to us, but that's because we're not the sorts of characters to whom those particular arguments would be efficacious.
So you think, but then the truth happiness that Katya part comes in about being truth-directed. So the most efficacious might not be the most truth-directed. So there's at least a conflict there, and I was taking the truth-directedness on Katya's view at least to override the efficaciousness.
Right. So then you're going to have to wonder, like, so one, the truth-directedness, I want to hear more about how exactly we parse that out. So I want to think of that. One of the ways you might be able to get out of the you don't hold any beliefs is that the truth-directedness isn't going to be a doxa, but it's going to be an orexis or something of the sort. Like pantasanthropoi to edenai phusei or agonta, right? Like, or agontai. They desire to know. And it's that sort of desire-based thing that so you can maintain the desire for truth even after you've suspended all of your beliefs. Because it's just a desire.
So long as it's not incompatible with ataraxia, so long as you get to a psychological state that's sufficiently positive with that kind of lingerings.
And then final thought is, I was surprised.
But it seems like a disturbance if you're desiring truth and you don't have it. It seems like that's primarily
Oh, no.
what's the cause of these disturbances.
But this is one of those. So one, you're going to want to moderate the desire potentially. Like you're going to want to moderate all of your desires. But
okay.
more importantly, once you've got this argumentative dunamis, as soon as it bubbles up and you start feeling a desire for truth, and you like latch onto an argument for P, you're able to dispel it with an argument for not P or something of the sort. And you scratch the desire for truth itch because you've engaged in investigation, but you're back immediately to the state of ataraxia. Is how I've always wanted to see this happening.
I think that's a coherent view.
Conceptually possible. But then, so the final bit is I was surprised that you didn't talk more about the whole dunamis bit. So you might think that one of the other ways you block the pill move is by saying you can think of a pill as producing like specific cognitive, like temporary cognitive states, but what you want is something that's stable. And what secures the stability is the dunamis.
That's the first option. So that's why you'd want to train your patient so that they could do this on themselves or something like that, which the pill doesn't secure.
Exactly.
So yeah, that's why I made that the first option for something like that.
Yeah, and so I think that's the one that like is most coherent at least in response to that.
And I haven't seen that much in the literature, so it's for the long-term stability or something like that. Yeah, I haven't seen that argument about...
Because, well, it seems like in a lot of the ways these people are conceiving of ataraxia, it's like it sounds almost like it could be a one-off thing, right? Like it just happens that today I get ataraxia and then tomorrow I wake up and like we're off to the races again.
It often just so happens, definitely.
Well, but it just so happens. The fact that it just so happens that I achieved the state of ataraxia just like per happenstance or something to start, although not accidentally.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean that it has to be only momentary. It could just so happen that I reach a perpetual state of ataraxia, right? But once I've reached the perpetual state of ataraxia, I'm going to maintain the perpetual state of ataraxia.
Yeah.
So, and I think that ataraxia for these thinkers really is once you get there, especially once you get there by way of this, the only way to get there is by way of this dunamis. And once you've got there, you're there. Or at least it's going to be really hard to dislodge you from that. And so I think stability plays like a much more central role to their conception of ataraxia than at least what some of those people you were quoting.
And I could try to find remarks about temporality and ataraxia in the text. See what's the most kind of what view I can get.
Yeah. And it may be that I'm completely wrong, but that's always been the impression I've had. Okay.
Any last questions?
Cool. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you guys.
I just wanted to clap for that, just because it was also a performance. That was great. Can I suggest that we just like toast? To a really successful workshop. Oh. More than happy to oblige. So.
Same.
And let's all thank Thomas for
Yes.
getting us all together.
Did I step on you?
No.
Okay, sorry. And I was like, oh.
Oh, are you reaching?
This was a really wonderful weekend in a
Thank
beautiful
you.
spot and some really fascinating papers. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers.